Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive.
So you'll recall Joseph had been called out of imprisonment to interpret Pharaoh's troubling dreams. Those dreams, it was two dreams. One about 7 fat cows that were consumed by 7 thin cows, and one about 7 healthy ears of corn that were consumed by 7 withered ears of corn. Joseph explained that the dreams prophesied the same thing: 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of severe famine. Impressed, Pharaoh appoints him as second in command over all of Egypt. Joseph then sets out during that first 7 years, overseeing the storage of food during those prosperous years. Anybody recall what he asked for from everyone? I know it's been a couple of weeks ago, but essentially a fifth of what they produced, so 20%. It was kind of a 20% tax, if you will, that was assessed against everyone. That was stored up. Listen, it was a lot of stuff. It was very plentiful years. They had plenty to eat, even with 1/5 of the produce being taken. They had to build storage houses. They essentially built storage cities. They had such a wealth and abundance of food that they were storing up over these 7 years. And so that's kind of the plan that Joseph came up with to solve the problem that they were facing. Joseph's insight and his administrative skills led him to be exalted to this position of great authority and influence in Egypt. That authority and influence had very broad and lasting effects. There's just a whole bunch of effects that it had, some of which we probably don't even fully realize all the time. But the most obvious ones being he had great influence over Pharaoh. So much so that his entire family ends up getting moved and living in Egypt. They're granted some of the best land that Egypt had to offer, which put them in a very good position for a while. Anybody remember, and this is kind of getting ahead, but anybody remember what changed between those years when they were living in Egypt as welcome guests and when they became slaves? Okay, so Pharaoh that knew Joseph died, and a Pharaoh came into power that did not know Joseph. And they became afraid of the prosperity of Joseph's family. So Joseph's influence was extremely powerful, and it lingered on even after he died. But a generation did arise that didn't know Joseph, and that began problems. However, we're going to see in just a moment that the legacy of Joseph actually came to bless his family and even the world a lot in various ways that no one at the time would have thought about. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to start tonight in verse 50 of chapter 41. It says, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. And so he marries the daughter of one of the Egyptian priests. And he has 2 children. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. And so this was kind of a way to memorialize that things had gotten better for Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery, you'll remember. He was falsely accused of sexual impropriety with his master's wife. He was imprisoned and left there for years. Things had gotten better for Joseph. And he says, God has allowed me to forget all that. And so he names his first son in honor of that. And he named the second one Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So what had been a land of affliction, Egypt, had become a fruitful land for him. And so he memorialized that in the name of his second son. When the 7 years of plenty which had been in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said, then there was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. All right, so this is a widespread famine. I don't know what famine in all the lands should be understood as being exactly. I'm just going to say it this way. That whole region of the world was affected by this famine. I don't know that it was a worldwide famine. I don't know that that's the point that's being made. But all of the nations around Egypt were also affected by this famine. All the region of Mesopotamia, all the region that we've read about up to this point in the scriptures was affected. That means that all the people were affected, except Egypt had bread. Why did Egypt have bread? Because of Joseph. And that's kind of important. We've mentioned this a few times. Before we go any further, I want to talk about it a little bit more. I don't know how much I'll get into it. Some people have lists of 75 different things to show this. I don't know that all 75 of them are significant, but Joseph is presented to us as a shadow of Christ. Okay, that's the role of this story. And in fact, if you go to the New Testament, to the book of Acts, in chapter 7, we have a record of that final sermon that Stephen preached. And there's a big block of that sermon that is dedicated to talking about the very events that we're studying. Now, who was Stephen preaching about? He was preaching to people after Christ had been crucified and resurrected and ascended and the church had been established. And this was a gospel sermon that he was preaching Christ. And that sermon includes an awful lot about Joseph. Verse 6, God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be aliens in a foreign land, that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. That's about the eventual enslavement. Actually, I guess I want to back up to... That's good enough. The eventual enslavement of the children of Israel, right? Whatever nation to which they should be in bondage, I myself will judge, said God, and after that they will come out and serve me in this place. He gave them the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. And who are the 12 patriarchs? Joseph's brothers. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt, and yet God was with him. I'm just going to make a quick observation. How did Jesus' earthly brothers receive him? They thought he was crazy. They thought he was grandiose. They thought he was having these illusions of grandeur, correct? Which is exactly what Joseph's brothers believed about him. And exactly why he was delivered to his enemies. Next question. What happened to Jesus eventually? He was delivered to his enemies. How? by his brethren. Not his physical brothers, but by one of the 12 that was with him all the time. And you keep on going. It's just over and over and over and over again. There's several things in this story that we're going to try to highlight. I'm going to try to remember to highlight them as we come upon them. One of them, for instance, just to kind of give you some foreshadowing of what we're talking about. When Joseph's brothers, if you've read ahead, you'll know this. If you hadn't read ahead, you know the story well enough that you probably know this. When Joseph's brothers first came to him seeking bread, Joseph immediately knew who they were. Did they recognize him? No. When Jesus came to his brethren, did they recognize who he was? No, but did you know who they were? Yes. What did Joseph do for them? Even though they didn't recognize him, what did he do for them anyway? He gave them the food that they needed. What did Jesus do when he came to earth? He came as the bread out of heaven. So there's just constant layers of parallel between these stories. That is not by accident. Joseph was the savior of his brethren, and Jesus was the savior of his brethren. And we're supposed to recognize and see what happened to Joseph, and what God was doing through Joseph was preparing people for what God was eventually going to do through Christ. Helping people recognize that if you know that what Joseph did was the work of God, and we know that, then we also should know that what Jesus did is the work of God. That's the point. So don't just read this thinking it's some old story about some history that doesn't really have anything to do with us. It does. It's very important. It made the core of the gospel sermon that Stephen preached. This story was the core of that sermon. And he was talking to them about Jesus and about the salvation that was available through Christ. And about the fact that they had rejected the Savior, just like Joseph had been rejected. And so, as we read through this and study these next chapters of the story of Joseph, we need to read them through those eyes and see those things and understand those parallels and learn from this insight into what was happening through Christ. All right. So, the famine has begun. Everybody's starving to death except for Egypt has bread. Then it says, so when all the land of Egypt was famished, and so what they had on hand in their homes has now been exhausted. And what's the word famished mean? Yes. You'll notice that the root of famine and famished is exactly the same root. We use that word very loosely today. Oh, I'm famished. We're not famished when we say that. Just like we're not starving when we say, oh, I'm starving. You know, I hadn't eaten anything in 2 hours. I'm starving. No, you're not. These people were famished. They were running out of food. So the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, you shall do. There's a parallel right there. What did God tell people about his Christ? This is my beloved son, whom listen to him. That's the exact same thing. It's the exact same message. Pharaoh says to the people, listen to Joseph. He's your Savior. God said to us, listen to Jesus. He's your Savior. Yes, ma'am.
Jesus' lineage are Christians who have obeyed the gospel and are also not all Jews.
Okay. Yes. And so, and I was going to talk about that a little bit, and I didn't do it. I moved on, so I'm glad you brought it up. These two children of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, became tribes of Israel, right? Now, Israel didn't exist yet. The nation of Israel didn't exist. These tribes of people didn't exist. The individual whose name was changed to Israel and his sons were alive, but the nation hadn't yet been formed. But the people who would form that nation included the sons of Joseph, who were Ephraim and Manasseh. They were half Egyptian. So we need to keep that in mind. There's the lineage of Jesus is full of non-Jewish heritage. At various points, people from outside of Judaism. We think about this big exclusive aspect of Judaism, but the fact of the matter was there was only a handful of nations that God said, don't marry them, don't have children with them, don't have anything to do with them. And they were particularly bad nations who had possessed the land of Canaan, who had mistreated the people of God, and who God was judging when he told Israel to go in and to annihilate them. Unfortunately, they didn't do it. And that became a problem for them forever. But it's not like God was excluding every person on the planet. And these are two of the patriarchs of the nation who were half Egyptian. All right. Go to Joseph, he'll tell you what to do when the famine, verse 56, was spread all over the face of the earth. Okay, there we go. There's the answer to our question. Now, again, whether that's literal or hyperbole all over the known world, the occupied world at the time, you can read it however you want to. It doesn't matter. It was a huge, great famine that affected all of these nations. When the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. And the people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the earth. Okay, so all of the nations that were around there that knew that Egypt had food, they came to Egypt for food. So the Egyptians and the rest of the countries around them are all buying this food that Joseph has stored. Where's that money going? Into the treasury of Egypt. This is how Egypt became an extremely powerful and wealthy nation. One of the great nations in history. What happened to all of that wealth? Was God sending Joseph to Egypt to make Egypt wealthy? And is that why Egypt was filling its coffers at this time? Was because God was concerned about Egypt? What happened to all that money? It did. Look with me, if you will. Just flip over real quick to the book of Exodus. First in chapter 3, verses 21 and 22. This is after the 400 years of slavery. This is Moses has been sent at this point. The 10 plagues have happened, are going to happen. I guess in chapter 3, it's talking about what will be. It hasn't been yet. But anyway, look at verses 21 and 22 of chapter 3. And I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. You will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians. And then if you go to chapter 12, verses 35 and 36 of Exodus chapter 12. Now the sons of Israel had done according to the words of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. So people ask, how could a people who were in slavery for 400 years and go out into the wilderness have all this silver and all this gold to do all the things that they did, building the temple or the tabernacle and overlaying everything with gold and building these silver trumpets that God commanded to be built? And where'd they get all that from? From the treasuries of Egypt. Where did Egypt get it from? From selling this food when Joseph was there. Why was Joseph sent into Egypt? To further the plan of God to save man through Christ. This is all providence. What is providence? Okay. Clearly, you can pick up on the root word being the same between provide and providence. What does it mean to provide? Okay, there's a reason for that. What is hospitality? Yeah, hospitality is to be supplied your needs. We don't think of it that way. We think of it as just waving to people and being nice and inviting them over for dinner parties and stuff, but that's not hospitality. True hospitality is providing the needs of people. True hospitality was provided, for instance, by the Samaritan to the man who had been beaten and left for dead on the road. When he stopped and rendered aid and bound up his wounds and carried him into the inn and provided him a place to stay so that he could heal properly and have all the food that he needed and all that. That's what true hospitality looks like. Not just being a nice guy or running a restaurant. We call it the hospitality industry. You can't really have hospitality that is industry, because hospitality is simply what? Providing the needs of people. And so, yes, there's a connection between providence and hospitality, because providence is simply the provision of what is needed, only it's done how? In foresight. To see ahead of time what is going to be needed and to make provisions for it being there when it's needed. That is what God is doing. This is the providence of God at work. Joseph is sent into Egypt to make provisions so that this people would one day become the nation of Israel and bring Jesus into the world. And this wealth that is going to be amassed under Joseph's rule is eventually going to be transferred to the nation of Israel. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And so that's what's going on here. This isn't God just going, hey, you know what, I'm going to make these Egyptians rich. No, it's God making provision to carry out and fulfill the promise that he made to Abraham. What was the promise he made to Abraham again? Through your seed, all nations will be blessed. All right, we're still working toward that end. This is God carrying out that plan and making provision for that plan to be successful. Jacob saw, chapter 42, that there was grain in Egypt. Now, Jacob is Joseph's father. Jacob has his name changed to Israel. Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, just like everybody else is being talked about in those earlier verses. Jacob saw there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, why are you staring at one another? I love that line. Jacob goes, why are y'all standing around looking at each other? Okay, we're hungry, and we don't have any crops, and our flocks are starving to death. Why are y'all just standing around looking at each other? That's the same question I have when I pass highway crews all the time. Why are they just standing around looking at each other? What do we want them to be doing? Some type of constructive work. After all, that's why they're called construction workers. They're supposed to be doing something constructive. That's exactly what he said. Why are you just staring at each other? Behold, I've heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some from that place so that we may live and not die. Don't just stand around here twiddling your thumbs. Go to Egypt and buy some food. Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. Why 10? How many are there? Hold on. There's 12? Which one was no more? Except for he was. He just didn't know he was. So really there's 13 sons. Joseph is sitting in Egypt. So he thinks there's only 12. Benjamin's been born, but Benjamin's, oh yeah, I added one. There's 12. Joseph is out, there's 11, and Benjamin's a baby. And so the 10 that are left go. Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, I am afraid that harm may befall him. Okay, so why not send Benjamin? And by the way, baby is an accommodative term. Benjamin was not an infant. He was the second son of Rachel. When he was born, Rachel died. There was no more children. He was actually Joseph's only full brother. And he had kind of taken the place of Joseph for him. You'll recall, who was his favorite? Joseph. Why was Joseph his favorite? It was Rachel's firstborn. So Jacob's like, he's kind of overprotective. He'd already lost Joseph. He didn't want to lose Benjamin. So I don't care, all the rest of y'all can go, but Benjamin's staying with me. I can take care of Benjamin. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. And Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Stop. Anybody remember any dreams from Joseph's childhood? One of his dreams was that there's 12 sheaves, and the other 11 are going to bow down to the one, and I'm the one. And that's one of the reasons they hated him. And yet, here it is. Now, do they realize that this is the fulfillment of the dream? Absolutely not. They don't even know they're looking at their brother. Now, how could they be looking at their brother and not know that it's Joseph? Okay, so there's been some time going by. What else? Now, listen, he didn't just live in Egypt. He was part of the royal family. He's wearing the robes of Egyptian royalty. He's wearing the headdress of Egyptian royalty. He's probably shaved his head as the Egyptian royalty did. He's wearing eye makeup like the Egyptians did. They don't recognize him. Where did they expect that he was? They had no idea. The last thing they knew, they sold him into slavery to a bunch of people. Did they know he was in Egypt? No. They didn't sell him to Potiphar even. They sold him to some nomadic people. They were not expecting him, and then they had no reason to believe it. He had grown up and he was looking at what language was he speaking? Yeah, more than likely he was speaking Egyptian. So, they didn't recognize him. They had no idea that this was the fulfillment of that dream that made them hate their brother all those years before. But what we find out is God was telling Joseph long before he did these things that, Joseph, you're part of the plan. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. So you got to understand, when it says he disguised himself to them, it's not in his appearance. He didn't put on a little Groucho Marx glasses. He didn't act like their brother. He wasn't nice to them. He didn't say, hey, it's good to see y'all again. Instead, he spoke harshly to them. He said to them, where have you come from? Did he know the answer to that question? Why did he ask it? He was pretending he didn't know. That's exactly what he was doing. He was selling this act that he doesn't know them. If he had started telling them all kinds of things about themselves and asking all kinds of personal questions that only he could know, they might go, what? Wait a minute. How do you know all that? So he's asking questions instead of making statements. And he says, where have you come from? They said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. But Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, you're spies. Did he really believe they were spies? No. What's that about? He's still misleading. He's still covering the whole internet. He's acting the way that a foreign dignitary would act to strangers and foreigners who've come into their land in the middle of a famine. What are you here for? You're trying to spy on us. That's exactly how the Russians assume every foreign journalist is that come into their nation. By the way, they're not the only ones. We do the same thing. If Russians get sent over here, we immediately start watching them, assuming what? They're spies. It's the same thing. There's nothing new under the sun. The same kinds of things are going on. So he's playing the game. You've come to look at the undefended parts of our land. Now, why would anyone want to attack Egypt? They had food. Why buy food if you can do what? They said to him, no, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. That's kind of a stretch. Your servants are not spies. Yet he said to them, no, but you've come to look at the undefended parts of the land. But they said, your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more. Somebody used that language a little earlier when I asked that question about where the other two were. What did they mean by that? Well, they're just going along with the presumption. And maybe they've started believing their own deception. I don't know, but they allowed their father to believe he was dead. And so they're figuring by now he probably is. Joseph said to them, it is as I say to you, you're spies. And again, this is not anything unusual either. There is a journalist in prison in Russia right now that the Russians are saying, what about? You're a spy. And he's saying what? No, I'm not. I'm just a journalist. And they're saying, no, you're a spy. And the people that he works for are saying, no, he's just a journalist. And they're saying, no, he's a spy. This is the same thing that's going on here. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place until your youngest brother comes here. All right. All right, let's put you to the test. You say you've got a younger brother. Let's see. Send one of you that he might get your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you're spies. So he creates this test. Now, again, does Joseph believe they're spies? So why all of this about, well, I'm going to put you in jail and send one of you back, and if your younger brother comes, then I'll believe you. But if you, what's all that about? He didn't know this younger brother. He didn't know this brother exists. So guess what? He wants to see his brother. So he put them all together in prison for 3 days. Joseph said to them on the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. That's an interesting statement. That actually should have made them go, huh? Because did the Egyptians fear the God of Jacob? They were, the pharaohs were gods to them. So that should have made somebody go, huh? But anyway, for I fear God, if you're honest men, let one of your brothers be confined. Let one. So he's changed now. He's not, I'm going to confine all of you and send one back. He's now saying, just let one of you stay here, and I'll let the rest of you go. Go carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and you will not die. And they did so. So this is what he actually does. He waits for 3 days, but what does he actually do? He gives them food to bring back to the family. He is providing bread to his kinsmen. That's what he's doing. And seeking to meet this younger brother. They said to one another, truly we're guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. So what do they start thinking? Like all guilty people, they're paranoid, and they say what? The chickens have come home to roost. We didn't treat our brother right, and now we're getting put in this terrible position because of that. Reuben answered them, saying, did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy? By the way, we still do that too, right? Things get rough and we're getting a pickle, and we start saying what? Well, I told you. Didn't I tell you that? I told you this was going to happen. You would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood. They did not know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. So Joseph knows everything that's being said. They didn't realize that. He turned away from them and wept. Why did he weep? By the way, here's another one of those smaller little shadow things. Jesus wept over the condition of Jerusalem. Here he is weeping over the circumstances of his brothers. It's another one of those shadows. Why did he weep? But because of their predicament and the consternation and grief. This is empathy. He feels for them. He turned away from them and wept, but when he returned to them and spoke to them, he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money to his sack. And This is where you get a picture of Joseph, where Joseph is, well, he's a good guy, but he goes about it in some really torturous ways. They came to buy grain, and they paid for the grain. But what does Joseph do? He sends the money back with him. Now, there's more to this story. It comes up later. But on the surface, what we have right now is this. He's refusing to accept payment for them. He's taken money from everybody in the world to feed them, but his family, he's given grain to. But he put that money in their sack. What sack? The grain. Did they know they were getting their money back? No. He restored every man's money to his sack and gave them provisions for the journey, and it was done for them. So they loaded their donkeys with the grain and departed from there. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. Then he said to his brothers, my money's been returned, and behold, it's even in my sack. And their hearts sank. Why? Why did their hearts sink? Why didn't they jump up and down and say, hey, we got our money back? Because they're not stupid. They know this isn't by accident. Their hearts sank. They turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? So their paranoia is still reigning. This is the judgment of God as far as they're concerned, because they know what the accusation is going to be. When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies in their country. But we said to them, we're honest men, we're not spies. We're 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan. And the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, by this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me and take grain for the famine to your households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men. I will give your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Now, that was the rest of it, by the way, is if they turned out to be honest men by bringing the youngest brother in, he was going to let the brother free and open up trade relations with them, continue to sell them grain. It came about, as they were emptying their sacks, that behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed. Their father Jacob said to them, you've bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin? All these things are against me. Now, why does he say Simeon is no more? Because he's left in Egypt. Now, his assumption is connected to the fact that they found all the money still in the sacks. And the outcome of that is if Joseph is truly trying to find out whether or not they're honest men and they've stolen the grain and taken their money back with them, then what is Joseph's conclusion going to be? They're not honest men. What's he going to do with Simeon? So he puts two and two together and says, you know what? I'm going to lose Simeon too. And you want to take Benjamin? Reuben spoke to his father, saying, you may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. This is simply him saying, look, I'm going to take care of him. I'll make sure Benjamin gets back here. If I don't get Benjamin back here, you can kill my sons. Put him in my care, I'll return him to you. But Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Look, you've already made me a gray-headed old man by taking Joseph. You're not going to take Benjamin too. So the intrigue continues to build, but I want you to pick up on all the little bitty things in this that are paralleling things in the life of Christ, in the relationship between Jesus and the people. For instance, Joseph knew his brothers, but his brothers didn't know him. Jesus knew his brethren, but his brethren didn't know him for who he was, didn't accept him, didn't receive him, and in fact cried for him to be crucified. And so all of this is just a shadow substance thing. What's going on the whole time? Despite the fact that Joseph is being not recognized by his brothers, Joseph is still doing what? Providing for the needs and providing life to his brothers. He gave them the grain. He didn't take payment for it. While we were yet sinners, Christ died. There's just layer after layer after layer after layer of this that is worth picking up on. I'm out of time, so we're not going to be able to talk anymore about it. Next week is singing Wednesday, so we'll pick up in 2 weeks, and that's going to be January the 9th. It's the second on a Wednesday. No, the first is Monday, so it's going to be the 3rd, so it's going to be the 10th of 2024. Chapter 43 is where we will begin. Continue to read this. Continue to look for these shadows of what God would do through Christ, being seen in God's handling of these events. This is all the provision of God. And then understand that as we talk about these things further, the providence of God, Joseph, when he was sitting in jail, did not say, oh, this is the providence of God. Do you know when Joseph saw that it was the providence of God? I think it's chapter 50 that we read that. Way down the road, Joseph looks back and says, oh, this was God doing these things. What we're experiencing right now may not look like it, but God's hand is present. And his children have faith. All right, I got to stop.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love.